Welcome back, everybody, to the Land Between the Meadows. We're here today, me, Mr. Cable, and Mr. Hopkins, and we're going to talk some more about Garrard County, but we're going to a little bit of a different spin on it, because last episode we talked about how basically Garrard County was created, but these are more focused on some people of Garrard County. So what do you got for us today, Daniel?
First of all, thanks for having me on again, Jameson. The last time that we were together, we like you said, we did discuss sort of the town. As you see, the town, as we talked about, the town sort of, the city of Lancaster it was created officially in 1801. And that really started a sort of glorious decade for Garrard County. Garrard County becomes something of a political hotbed during the 1800s. And it sort of expired by 1900, and there's really not been a whole lot since then. I think that, I don't mean that to sound bad, but for a really small county, Garrard County held sort of higher level sway, maybe than you would have expected. So I want to start with a man named John Boyle, and John Boyle is who is. If Garrard County was a political hotbed in the 1800s, then John Boyle was the father who made it all happen. We've spent some time in the last, in a few different podcasts, talking about these explorers and these settlers that came from Virginia into Kentucky. And Boyle follows really the same route. He was born in 1774, so he's a little bit later than some of the earliest explorers. He was being born right about the time that Kentucky was being started to be fairly heavily settled. Yeah. So if you want to talk about like a first wave of early explorers, then Boyle sort of comes maybe in the second wave, as we talked about last time, when it was a little safer for families. But anyway, he comes from Virginia. He had a distinguished career that we'll get to in a second, but he settled near William Whitley's home in Crab Orchard, or between Crab Orchard and Stanford. So that's where we talked about stations, and that's where their family lived to start with before they eventually moved to Lancaster. And for anybody who's sort of unfamiliar, you can sort of draw a triangle between Stanford, Crab Orchard, and Lancaster. And Lancaster is about 10 miles from Stanford, straight to the south, and then it's about 10 miles from Crab Orchard. Crab Orchard to Lancaster is kind of a northwesterly direction. So we're talking about the city of Lancaster, and we're talking about people who really weren't that far from a lot of the early settlements in the state. So Boyle comes to Lancaster, and he becomes a lawyer. And shortly after he starts as a lawyer, he sort of becomes political. That's really not anything unusual at the time, and even today, it's really not either. So he moves into politics, but it was his connections as a politician while still living in Garrard County that sort of brought all of these different people in. And it's kind of interesting to see. There's there's 6 or 7 different guys who play various significant roles in the history of Kentucky that all sort of link back to Boyle, and they all serve as a lawyer in Lancaster for, sometimes it was just for a couple of years, sometimes it was for many years. Some of them ended up sort of living and dying in Lancaster. Yeah, but he was sort of, if you will, probably not the right word to use in a burgeoning democracy, but he was kind of a kingmaker, if you will. He was a U.S. representative. He was a judge on the Kentucky Court of Appeals, which will later become the Kentucky Supreme Court. It's what we now call the Supreme Court. And he eventually serves as a district judge, United States district judge in Boyle County, which is where Danville is, not far from Garrard and Lincoln County, was named after him.
Okay. So, I was waiting for you to get to that statistic. I was like, surely he's going to...
Well, it comes a little later because Boyle County wasn't made a county until 1842.
Yeah, so it is a later one.
It was one of the later ones. And it was actually after John Boyle had died. But anyway, a little bit about Boyle more. His home in Lancaster is actually still standing.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's hard to give directions on a podcast, but it stands just to the south of Lancaster Elementary.
Okay.
It's still in good shape. There's a woman who, for many, many years, was a prominent member. Her name's Kathy Valkyrie. She was a prominent member of the Garrard County Historical Society. She's still living. She's still involved in history. She's a little bit older, but she and her husband, they bought that house, I would say about 1990, and they did some work to it. So it's been sort of, I don't want to say remodeled, it's been restored, would probably be the way to look at it. But it's still right there. And that house, what's kind of interesting is that home, this probably tells you what you want to know about Boyle. That home was owned after Boyle he sold it to Samuel McKee, who was a congressman, U.S. congressman. Later, it went to George Robertson, who was a congressman, secretary of the state of Kentucky. He was also on the Kentucky Court of Appeals. That's who Robertson County is named after. And then it was also owned by Robert Letcher, who would be a U.S. congressman and governor of Kentucky, who actually was he was one who spent the majority of his life in Lancaster and Garrard County.
Yeah.
So that home, it's not really called this, but it kind of has the nickname of Home of Statesmen. And that was the home. So you can still see the house. I mean, obviously you can't tour it because there's a woman that still lives there. But it's kind of interesting that, and I think that shows Boyle's connections to everyone else, in that all of these people just sort of kept buying the same home. They sort of, it was almost like it was being handed down.
Yeah, not only was he a kingmaker, he was providing a house for everybody to live in.
Right. Absolutely. So Garrard County's political stance, if that's the right word, was probably best described as Whig to start with. Yeah. And then it sort of morphs into Republican politics. And in fact, even today, Garrard County is one of the staunchest Republican counties that there are. I mean, in years when there's governor races that the Democrat dominates, you can still count on, Garrard County is probably still going to vote for the Republican. Yeah. And, we've seen the state of Kentucky sort of go from Democrat a little bit more Republican of late, but Garrard County's been really Republican from the get-go.
All the way.
There's 3 governors who lived in Garrard County, and that's what people talk about tonight. There was Robert Letcher, William Owsley, and William O. Bradley. Letcher and Owsley, of course, have counties named for them in Eastern Kentucky, Letcher County and Owsley County. Bradley was very late 1800s, and so if we're talking about counties, the counties were pretty much already created by then, but we'll get to Bradley a little bit more in a second. So let's start first with Robert P. Letcher, or Black Bob was his nickname. And he was from Virginia. All of these guys were from Virginia. Well, not Bradley, but as we said, most of these early folks were from Virginia. And so Letcher comes to Virginia to Danville. Yeah. And he was enrolled at Joshua Fry's school. And I don't think there was really a name other than it was Joshua Fry's school. You may see it as like Fry's Academy. Yeah. For lack of a better word, it was sort of a frontier, I don't want to say law school. I'm not sure they were handing out law degrees necessarily. Yeah. People that came to that school were there to study, to, in many cases, be lawyers and leaders. And you really had 2 schools. You had Transylvania, which starts as a university in Lexington. Fry's school was sort of the intro to some of that. You'll see people that would go there to school to be educated, and sometimes they'd move on to Transylvania. But because he was in Danville, the connections between Danville and Lancaster and Stanford all being fairly close, some of these guys that were over there would come to Garrard County to work. You couldn't turning out lawyers in Danville, and there'd be enough work for them to be there. So this is where Boyle comes in. Boyle sort of serves, I don't want to use the word recruiter, but he sort of
brings people in.
A place for lawyering in Lancaster, and a lot of these folks sort of rolled in right behind him. Letcher becomes a lawyer, and he has a practice here in Lancaster. Now, Letcher was a Whig, and it wasn't long after that he became a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He serves 12 years, so that's 6 terms as a U.S. House of Representatives. And Letcher's role, in many ways, was as a middleman for Henry Clay. So I'll put you on the spot here. What was Henry Clay's nickname? Do you know?
Oh, I know it. The Great Compromiser. There we go.
Oh, good. I knew you would know it. So Letcher was, in a sense, sort of the bond that kind of connected Clay to his other compromisers. I'm going to give a quick plug for a book. People that are reading this or listening to this would probably be interested in reading this. There's a book by James Clotter, who's sort of the prominent Kentucky historian, teaches at Georgetown College. It's called Henry Clay, the Man Who Would Be President. And it came out in 2018. Really good biography. It's fairly long. It's about 400 pages or 450 pages, I think. But a really good story. And Letcher is a significant character in this story. Of course, Clay is a senator, and Letcher, as we said, in many cases was sort of the middleman between the Whig Party and then what was then called the Democratic Republicans. That the Republican part will be sort of dropped eventually. But so a lot of the compromises that Henry Clay achieved was in many cases because Letcher would go sort of back and forth, and it allowed.
He's the middleman.
He was, and it allowed, and Clay really, today, Clay receives a whole lot of the credit, and rightfully so. Letcher is almost a forgotten character in a lot of cases in national politics. But at the time, Letcher was recognized as a significant person in government. And we talk about like Letcher being a U.S. Member of the U.S. House of Representatives. At the time, of course, the country really didn't extend beyond the Mississippi River. So the amount of the states were fewer. And so Kentucky had a much larger congressional delegation at the time. Now, I mean, Kentucky would have 9-10 delegates, dependent upon representatives, sort of dependent upon the
population.
And of course, now it's down to 5, 6. So it's a small number. And so Clay, of course, being from Kentucky, he was a Whig. Letcher being from Kentucky, he was a Whig. They knew all the same people. It don't make sense that they would be, connected like that. Letcher sort of serves a few different roles after he was in the House of Representatives. He then comes back and is elected the 15th governor of Kentucky. He was in office from 1840 to 1844. I know some of your governor videos sort of referenced this, but at the time, Kentucky governors could only serve one term. And so they could only serve, they weren't allowed to serve 2 terms until, 1995, I think it was. Paul Patton was the first person to serve 2 terms.
Well, excluding connection, James Garrard, he served 2 terms. Like, he served 2 terms, but then they changed it after that.
The new Constitution that came through that changed that. That's correct. Yeah, you're right about that. After that, after he was governor, shortly thereafter, he's ambassador to Mexico. There's Zachary Taylor, who was not a Kentuckian, but Taylor he lived in Louisville, and he's buried in Louisville, even today. So that gives you a little bit of information there about Letcher. He was a Whig till the end. But the Whig Party dissolves. Dissolve might not be the right word, but the modern day Republican Party was created in 1854. And the Republican Party was sort of a mix of Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, Northern Democrats, which in most cases those two things were the same thing, but it wasn't all. And it was one of those things where I think there was a realization that there had to be a joint party, or they would never be able to defeat the Democrats.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party then splits over the issue of slavery, and that's pretty much why Abraham Lincoln was elected president.
Yeah.
He wasn't even on the ballot in like 7 states, but he won. The votes were split so much that he was able to win. Letcher associates himself with the Know Nothing Party before his death. So they may have been anti-slavery, but they were also anti-immigrant. The Know Nothing American Party, as its official name. The Know Nothing Party was sort of the nickname. But Letcher, though, dies in 1861, so he died before really before the Civil War took hold. It was inevitable and it was coming. But Letcher's a significant character in Kentucky history. Yeah.
Well, I mean, anybody that is connected to Henry Clay, especially to that extent, has had a big influence on Kentucky, and obviously being the governor is big as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's move to the second one. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say. So who's next here on the governor? Well, let me ask this question before we go on. Yeah. And this is like right off. How many people, or how many? I guess it's hard to say. I was going to say like how many people. Which county has the most governors from in Kentucky? But it's kind of hard to say because in this case they were born in Virginia and so forth. But
I was doing that was my prep for this. I was trying to figure that out, but I realized pretty quickly that it's almost impossible to do because, like you said, so many people were born in
Virginia or Maryland,
but then in some cases, the counties were as the counties were being created. I don't actually move, but my home
county.
Abraham Lincoln's a really good example. Abraham Lincoln talks about being born in a log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, that's an accurate statement. Yeah. But hey, it's right in the dead square middle of LaRue County. So, it really became difficult it became almost impossible to really find that out.
Yeah.
Using one single standard.
Well, then you have somebody who was born in this county, but then they moved to another county.
Sure.
And that's so it's very hard. Yeah. It's hard.
Absolutely. So let's
go ahead. Next guy.
You said the next guy, and it's a literal description because the governor that replaced Robert Letcher was William Owsley, from Kentucky, from Garrard County as well. So Owsley follows a real similar path as Letcher. He was born in Virginia. They moved to Kentucky at a very young age. His family settled between Crab Orchard and Stanford. I don't know specifically where that was. Obviously, William Whitley was between Crab Orchard and Stanford, so I don't know if they were. It sounds like Boyle's family was sort of buttressed right up next to Whitley. I don't know if Owsley was necessarily that close. It's that between Crab Orchard and Stanford, that would be roughly Whitley's territory. So a little bit of scandal here to start with. So Owsley's a teacher, but he was a super young teacher. He was 21 years old, and he marries one of his students who was 17 years old. Now, you and I are both school teachers, so, I don't know about you, but when I hear, sometimes you'll hear stories about improprieties between teachers and students, and it's kind of like, oh, that's not really good. That's kind of what we see here. He was 21, she was 17. Yeah. Obviously, those are marrying ages at the time. I guess technically they still could be. But,
kind of a little old, actually.
But his father was, I think his father serves as the sheriff, but Owsley eventually served as the deputy sheriff of Lincoln County. So you kind of see, he goes from teacher to sheriff to politician. You get the sense that Owsley was kind of unsure of what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
But it was during that time as deputy that he comes into contact with John Boyle, which would make sense. You're a deputy, you're in the court system, and you meet a lawyer. Of course, as we mentioned, Boyle from Lancaster. And so Owsley studies law, and he later opens up an office in Lancaster. So you get into a little bit of what Owsley did. He serves as a state representative before being appointed to the Court of Appeals. And as we say, Court of Appeals, today's Supreme Court. Owsley's most significant role is something that was connected to Andrew Jackson, and that was the Bank of the United States. In 1832, the Bank of the United States charter was set to run out. There were a lot of people that debated whether the United States needed to be in the business of a bank. Yeah. Some people argued that kept currency flowing throughout the country. Other people argued that it was extremely political, and the money would be given to one place at the expense of another, and they sort of picked winners and losers, and that there was a belief that the government should not reward Kentucky at the expense of Tennessee, if you want to put it that way, or maybe North and South. The Civil War, what eventually happens at the Civil War, nearly broke out 2 or 3 different times. In the 1832 bank crisis was one of those things. Yeah. But Owsley in Kentucky was involved in a debt case, which basically, to really dumb it down, it centers around whether banknotes could be accepted from the Bank of Kentucky. Yeah. And at the time, you're still not, you're in a situation where money, especially paper money, was issued by a lot of different places. Yeah. And whether or not it could be accepted became controversial because people had all kinds of money. People had coin from France, from Spain, from Britain, from America. They had paper money, and it was a trustworthy issue. But ultimately, this sort of morphs into what becomes known as the Old Court, New Court controversy. Yeah. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, I am very much into history, but court is one of the least interesting things. But I can't say that I've spent a whole lot of time studying and researching the old court and new court. But ultimately, there were 2 different courts that emerged that both argued that they were the supreme or the highest court, if you want to get to that. But Owsley was sort of prominent in that old court, new court decision. Yeah. And finally, what will end up happening is that there will be a creation of a Kentucky Supreme Court that replaces the Court of Appeals. Yes. And I would encourage you to look that up if you would. But Owsley resigns from his position, so you can kind of get the sense that Owsley was on the losing end of that. So he was Secretary of State for a couple of years, 1835 and 1836, and then later goes on to be governor of Kentucky from 1844 to 1848, which probably tells you a little bit about how divided the state was politically. Yeah. That he resigned over a court issue, but then later gets elected. So that was a divide that happened, that existed for a long time. But anyway, he serves as Secretary of State, eventually would be the governor, served from 1844 to 1848. And then he dies very similar to Letcher. He died right after him. 1862. Owsley County in Kentucky is named after him. William Owsley's home is still here in Garrard County. It was called Pleasant Retreat. It's just south of town.
It's quite
for many years.
It's large. I mean,
it is. There's similarities, I guess you would say. Like, you can see where, if you've been to William Whitley's house, you can see how that a little bit of time allowed for a little bit bigger of a house. You know, it's slightly bigger. It sort of fits for the time. In many cases, if you think about sort of like the homes that you'd see in like Gone with the Wind, with the big porches, they're there's some porches and that kind of thing that you'll see on Owsley's house. It was a historical site. I mean, I guess it still is a historical site, but it was recently, a couple years ago, purchased. And the back house has been made into a restaurant. It's called Bradford Barbecue, a terrific restaurant. But they use the lower part of the house as like a fancy dining room. I think they live in the upper part of the house, but I'm actually glad they did, because the design was for the Owsley house to be like a state park, and it just never really took off as that. The state didn't really want that. And so at least it's being used, and it still looks really nice, and you can see
it does.
You see that it's just on the south end of Lancaster. That's there. So technically it's called Pleasant Retreat, but most people refer to it as the Owsley house. So that's Governor 2. The last governor is William O. Bradley, and he was the only one of the three that actually was a Garrard County native. He would be the first Republican governor of Kentucky. There you go. So, Kentucky was not a Republican state. Even today, there's only been a handful of Republican governors. But he was the first Republican governor of Kentucky. He was from Garrard County. He lived right across from where Lancaster Elementary is today, although there's no house. Now. He was the second Republican U.S. senator from Kentucky. So Bradley is a significant person as well. He was an abolitionist, obviously desired to see slavery end and worked. What I read, and this is a direct quote of what I read, worked to improve the life for Black Kentuckians, specifically by assuring voting protection and appointing several African Americans to positions of influence in the state government. So kind of a man ahead of his time. But he was also, Kentucky was not, obviously Kentucky did not secede from the Union. Following the Civil War, Reconstruction, there were a handful of Reconstruction districts, and government and the military occupied several of these districts throughout the South. And as you look back on it, you'll see a lot of African Americans were elected to high political offices. Once Reconstruction ends in 1877, almost immediately the southern states began disenfranchising Black voters. Those African Americans who were serving in the Senate, the House of Representatives, immediately were recalled or lost their positions. Even in some states that were not, quote unquote, Confederate, they still had tendencies. There were people that were wanting to have similar rules. And Bradley plays a really significant role in trying to make sure that voting rights that had been extended to African Americans after the Civil War stayed with those same African Americans. At the time, of course, the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, was very much abolitionist and very much anti-slavery. And so it makes sense that Bradley would have been that. But Bradley serves as governor, and he later serves as U.S. senator. So Bradley's kind of an unknown name, I think, a lot of times, but he really is. He should be highly regarded for what he did. Now, if I can give you one other thing about Bradley, he was succeeded as governor by a man named William Taylor. You know the name William Taylor.
Do I? Yes. I'm aware of William Taylor.
Okay. Who did William Taylor defeat to become governor?
Goebel.
And in fact, what ends up happening to our friend William Goebel?
Well, he becomes governor, and then he dies.
Well, maybe we shouldn't laugh, but the whole election was controversial. I'm sure you sort of know the whole story. This was 1899. Of course, as we said a minute ago, you only served one term. And so it wasn't uncommon for the person who followed the previous governor to sort of, piggyback off of, I guess you would, some of what that governor had done, because that governor didn't get the chance to run a second time. The case over who should win, who should lose, and I'm sure, I don't know if you've done a podcast about this or not, but you definitely need to. because there's way more stuff than what I want to hit on right here. But Bradley was on the legal team for the Republicans, for William Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
The case eventually makes its way all the way to the Supreme Court. But long story short, Goebel gets killed. And it was, he had the pro-Taylor factions, the pro-Goebel factions. But I really think that, you and I think I've talked about this before, but when Goebel was killed, that sort of, I think people realized that was a step too far. That was too much. And that really swayed the electorate to think, like, we don't need to be killing
each other for
steps of the Capitol.
Yeah.
And in fact, Goebel, even today, is the only sitting governor in American history who was assassinated. So Bradley was Bradley. I think we can see that Bradley was a
important figure.
Lawyer. A lawyer first. A lot of these people were, and so even after he was no longer governor, he was still lawyering. He serves one term in the Senate. Decides that he will not serve another. This is in the early 1900s. This is sad, the day that he announced that he would not seek re-election, he was involved in a streetcar accident in Washington, and he died shortly after. So, and he was 67 years old. So, I guess that was sort of old for the time, but he didn't die of ill health. You can almost imagine, think about the day that you're going to go in and tell your boss,
I'm out of here.
I'm retiring. This is it. I'm not. Whatever day it is, that my last day, that'll be it. And then you're in a streetcar accident. And you don't get to live to see it. So, but those are your three Garrard County governors: Robert Letcher, William Owsley, and William O. Bradley. So.
Well, I point this out randomly, though. A lot of Williams were the governor of Kentucky.
Right.
But the connection to the Goebel-Taylor one, that's pretty interesting because I'm pretty sure as far as recording, the Goebel and Taylor one will have come out probably about 3, maybe 2 weeks before this comes out. So pretty good connection to that as well. But the Goebel-Taylor thing was very, it's very political, but very, it was a sticky time during Kentucky politics. But
let me give you, I want to get more things about Garrard County, but I just want to mention this. To talk about Garrard County, I think that we get a little sense of what Garrard County looked like in the 1800s. There was between 10 and 11,000 people that lived in Garrard County. Every census from 1820 through 1890. So in 1900, you could say this: there were 12,000 people that lived in Garrard County. So if we want to talk about Garrard County being a significant place in Kentucky politics, there's 12,000 in 1900. In 1990, 90 years later, there's 11,000 people that lived in Garrard County. So in a 100-year period, the population of Garrard County did not rise. In fact, it dropped. And in fact, truth be told, in 1990, it was on the come up because in 1970, there was only 9,400 people in the whole county. So it had really just whittled down to very small numbers. It's about 16 or 17,000 people today. But if you think about Garrard County's role in politics in the 1800s, obviously, sometimes the first person, sometimes there's a person that's there first that makes things, that kind of gets the ball rolling. And that's what Boyle was. That's who John Boyle was. Once these people that had served significant roles sort of left, the whole county, starts to fade away. And I don't mean to say this as I don't mean to be critical of Garrard County. This is my home, and this is where I work, and this is where I love. But Garrard County's role on the statewide stage just all but disappeared in the 1900s. It's real, and it never came back to what it was in the 1800s. And I don't know if it ever will or not. But it was almost like a perfect storm of things that sort of hit that allowed for that.
Yeah, and that's kind of you kind of get those waves with many communities or towns, and not to put it this way, but in a way, the strong kind of survive. You take, say, Danville or Nicholasville. Well, maybe Nicholasville and its location to Lexington, but those places that are able to kind of Pulaski County would be one. That are able to get those political footholds or just commerce areas. Hold on.
Mm-hmm. And political is a good term to use there, because Garrard County clearly hitched their wagon with the Republican Party, and then the 1900s was a Democratic decade in Kentucky. And so if the governor is always a Democrat, then it's highly unlikely that any of even if they're leading Republicans,
are going to get
any kind of significant postings. You're not going to be the Secretary of State. You're not going to be, treasurer. You're not going to be governor, lieutenant governor. And so significant Republican leaders who may have been from Garrard County or wherever they were from, it kind of stalled out just because of a lack of, that's not how people voted.
Yeah.
So, sometimes you're lucky to begin with, and then I'm sure kind of unlucky. But Garrard County, like I said, there's a few other, we mentioned Samuel McKee, who was U.S. Congressman, George Robertson, who was a congressman from Garrard County. There was another man by the name of George Washington Dunlap, who was a congressman. He was not from Garrard County, but graduated from Transylvania, was a lawyer, practiced law in Garrard County, sort of following those same steps. He ended up being a state representative. He was on the circuit court for 30 some odd years. And then he was in 1861, he was elected to Congress. And then he was also a United States judge down in Tennessee. So yet another one of those people that sort of ties themselves to Boyle. But I want to finish with one last person, and that was a man by the name of Allen Burton. And I don't have a ton of information about Allen Burton, but Allen Burton was appointed by President Abraham Lincoln to be the ambassador to the nation of Colombia in South America. Burton was from Kentucky. He was appointed in 1861, but this is a direct quote from the United States government website. He was commissioned, but, quote, seems not to have served under this appointment. So trying to figure out, why would you be appointed but then not go? And there's a couple of different reasons. If you're appointed in May of 1861, that's right in the middle of the Civil War.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Colombia was sort of in the middle of governmental changes, that they were called the Republic of New Granada. Then they become the Grenadine Confederation, and then they become the United States of Colombia. These were sort of unsettled times there as well. I can't tell you why Allen Burton didn't go, but it could have to do with issues in the States. It could have issues there as well.
There's definitely a reason out there that he did not go.
Right. But he does go then. In 1863, he does go, and he served from 1863 until 1866 as the representative, or as the ambassador. The term is actually minister resident. So ambassador is not the official title, but it looks like the term ambassador wasn't used until a little bit later for really anybody. But his role was sort of the American representative in that country.
Yeah.
He comes back to Lancaster after he resigns, and died 12 years later, and he's buried in the Lancaster City Cemetery even today. So that's Allen Burton, who took Garrard County on a national scale or international scale.
International, yeah. He was down in Colombia making deals, I guess, or doing what it's. Yeah, but if you have one country, the country that you're from is in a civil war, and the country that you're going to, or is also in a civil war, it's probably a good idea to just stay put, not worry about that.
But yeah, so that's a little bit about some kind of 1800 who's of Garrard County. So
yeah, well, that's cool how well, just I mean, you don't see too many places that can sit here and say, we had this many influential people at this time, and it's such a good point to talk about though the rise and then to say the fall of Garrard County, how that kind of went, because it's very true. So as we go on into Lancaster, this kind of gets the bulk of. I mean, we've covered quite a bit of a good chunk of the history, but we'll come back and revisit Garrard County as we will need to for many other counties as well. But Garrard County, does Garrard County have like a slogan, nickname, anything like that? Besides,
I don't know. No, I don't think there's like a. There's a label or a logo or anything like that.
Yeah.
Just I think most people in Garrard County, as long as you pronounce it correctly,
they're happy. yeah, Garrard.
Yeah, not Garrard, not Garrard, not Gerard.
Yeah. Well, I guess that'll wrap us up here. We'll revisit Garrard County at some point. There's many stories to be told. But again, thanks for listening. You can find us at KY History Pod on Twitter or Facebook, or email us, thelandbetweenthemeadow@gmail.com. And you can find Mr. Hopkins here at dhopkins_9 on Twitter, correct? Anything else, Mr. Hopkins?
As always, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to dive into some Kentucky history.
All right. Thanks you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.